this on here in the committee, but it's certainly a huge issue. So thank you very, very much. Senator Fischer.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Bennon, for being here today. As we discussed last time that you were before the committee, Nebraska has played a leading role in the regulation of digital assets at the state level. In 2021, Nebraska passed legislation permitting the creation of banks or creation of divisions within existing banks for the purpose of trading in cryptocurrencies. Additionally, Nebraska's Department of Banking and Finance has used state laws and authorities from the Federal Commodities Exchange Act to provide robust oversight while at the same time fostering fair digital asset markets. State regulators are the closest to the people, and they serve a key role in preventing fraud and abuse in digital asset markets. Do you have any concerns about federal legislation preempting strong and effective state laws regarding digital assets, and is the CFTC equipped to fill any gaps that might exist there?
Thanks, Senator Fischer, and appreciate the question, and certainly remember very clearly that back and forth we had a few years ago. And as I mentioned back then, and I'll repeat it because it is important, our state partners are some of our most important partners and ones that we take that relationship very seriously because, as you mentioned, they are the boots on the ground for retail investors, for investors across the country, including Nebraska, and making sure that we're getting to every component of a local community to make sure folks are not being defrauded. Ultimately, in answering your question more directly, I think with markets, and this has been something we've learned over decades in the U.S. and globally, having a national market system is a more efficient and effective means to bringing liquidity and trading to a single point, as opposed to having a scattershot or a state-by-state national market system. That said, putting the market element aside, I do think states should preserve rights around fraud, custody, which goes to an extent the point I was making with Senator Lujan about states preserving their rights for money transmission across state borders and inside state borders as well. And then ultimately, and I will just point out again, the extreme importance of a state attorneys general being able to preserve fraud authority and not be preempted. So I think there's a balance between creating some federal system because there is efficiencies in having a single marketplace, but also ensuring that we're preserving certain elements of states' rights, whether it's in the fraud space, custody and payment space, so that the state will preserve the opportunities to protect its investors. And since we've discussed this a few years ago, my office has reached out to Nebraska. We are certainly very aware of the success that they've had and the leadership that they've played. So we'll continue to do that.
I was just going to ask if you've reached out. I know you've been in contact with Nebraska, with the department there. Have you reached out to other states? And do you see action increasing at the state level with state laws being implemented and put in force? Because I think anytime you talk preemption, it's because probably the federal government's moved too slowly.
Yeah.
And so states, as they should, step up. They're the laboratories that we have in our system. But it makes it then more difficult, I think, especially when you have states that have stricter laws in place than other states to try and thread that needle at the federal level.
We certainly, we have not necessarily spoken to every state in the union, but we've spoken to many. We are a part of multiple multilateral organizations, which include national level state securities regulators. We work closely with state security regulators on enforcement. And to your question, yes, I think states, many of them have been frustrated, and there are two components to it. There's the enforcement and customer protection side, which I think is really driving Nebraskans' efforts, because there is a lot of fraud out there, and there's a lot of opportunity to take advantage of vulnerable individuals in many different ways. And I think those individuals at the state level feel like they need to step up if the federal government's not moving in that direction. The other element, and I think, to the extent Senator Gillibrand certainly knows this, but different states that may have more robust and well-built-out financial systems like New York, you're seeing those regulators build out compliance programs and regulatory programs.
You point out in your testimony the need for appropriate funding to meet the mandate of new regulatory authorities for the CFTC, and you recommend a permanent fee for service model As an appropriator, I'm curious what this funding level would be. Would it just be administrative funding? Would it be hiring additional staff? Would it be IT? What is your thinking on that?
So all of the above, and as I mentioned to the chair, and I do want to correct the record, I mentioned 50 million in the first year and 30 in the second. It's actually the opposite, 30 and 50 in the first and second year respectively. But we've done a fair amount of work in this area because there's been multiple efforts to legislate around the space. So we've done analysis with different assumptions about how many individuals or entities would register with us. We're happy to share it with your office, but ultimately the funding would come from users, so it would be a fee-for-service model, and it would be for personnel, but also hardware itself, so data hardware, cyber hardware, any type of hardware we would need for surveillance and typical regulatory tools. So a mix of both. Again, a lot of assumptions. We would see how many would come in and register with us over time, but we would certainly look to appropriators to help set a level based on a request we made, and then offset that request by assessing the fees to the market participants.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Senator, let me look here on my, I think Senator Booker just came in the room. Just to talk about just in time.